Good evening, and welcome to the finale of our public lecture series, exploring the problems of digital privacy in our digital revolution. Dubbed the new oil, our personal data has become a commodity, one that powers new technologies and is increasingly mined and sold off. Our data is often used to manipulate us, to buy, to vote, to behave in a certain way. Today, we will hear three differing perspectives from leading experts on the subject of privacy. So first, are Brunel's professor of contemporary thought, a prolific journalist, essayist, and frequent broadcaster, as well as the celebrated author of novels including the recent trilogy of Umbrella, Shark, and Phone, tackling our most urgent and contemporary concerns, particularly the demise of privacy and the ubiquity of the mobile phone. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Will Self.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks very much. Nice to see you all here this evening. These are a public lecture series, and that's for you, the public. And I hope, more than likely, some of you live in the surrounding area around the campus. I sort of titled my segment of this evening loosely, "You Don't Have to Be the Unabomber to Go Off-Grid." And I think there's the word that came up, in conversation outside when we were milling around. Whenever you start to talk about resisting your engagement with what I prefer to call bidirectional digital media, because that expresses what's absolutely unique about the assemblage of the internet and the World Wide Web. When you start to talk about restricting your engagement with bidirectional digital media, the L word comes up right away. You're worried about being accused of being a Luddite. And I think it's particularly stressful, that accusation, because we have an aging population, and because those of us who are getting a bit older really don't want to be written off. We see what's happening and the crises that are happening in the NHS and in elder care at the moment, and we're very anxious about being shunted into a demographic category that's viewed as being out of the mainstream, unable to cope, not adjusting to this new technological change. So I think that's an anxiety. And I think the other thing is the very ubiquity of the technology itself. I mean, all new technologies are startlingly strange to people to begin with. I mean, you could go back and think about how startlingly strange the voice telephone must have been for that era, and how in the London of the turn of the 19th century and the 20th century, you had telephone parlors in which you could sit and listen to them singing in the Opera House in Covent Garden on the telephone at the end of the line. Well, you and I would think, why on earth would you do that? But of course, the exciting new technology would have driven that. And of course, artists and writers were very interested by the telephone when it came along. A writer like Ford Madox Ford wrote an entire novel called The Telephone, based on a series of telephone conversations. And then there comes a moment that, again, those of us who are a little bit older will be familiar with, even with large-scale technological change, when it's happened. It's just happened. And the technology becomes invisible to us. We're so used to using it that we don't even think about it anymore. And actually, I think because of the very nature of the phone, because we're better at, it's not really a phone, is it? It's a handheld computer. Because of the nature of the handheld computer, because of, in particular, capacitive touch, the fact that the interface with it is used by our own hands in that way, it becomes an extension of ourselves very easily in that way. And Nicholas Carr, one of the kind of critics of bidirectional digital media and its associated technologies, makes the point that it's fine. A skilled workman who uses a hammer or a skilled person who's using equipment or tools of any kind. They become an extension of their body, and that's fine, okay? We're good at that, humans. You might argue that our capacity to, in a sense, alter or adapt what we think of as extraception, the awareness of what's going on around and behind us, proprioception, our awareness of our own internal dispensation, is the very hallmark of what it is to be human. But Carr's point is, what if the tool that we're no longer conscious of being a part of us is a tool that replaces other tools, is a tool that renders other tools unnecessary? Yeah? And that's a very, very different and I would argue worrying state of affairs. And you do not have to be the poor old chief medical officer for England who's been making various, will be accused, and also in a rather kind of chauvinistic way because she happens to be a woman, of being kind of nanny-ish because she's been recommending that people get their children to come off screens and come off their phones before they go to bed and stuff like that. But how many of us here actually have the discipline to leave screen alone before bedtime? How many of us are suffering from insomnia and from a sense that the outside world is invading us even when we're at our most private, when our most removed, in theory, from bidirectional digital media, there it is inside us. And so part of my kind of segment this evening, and I don't know whether you're going to participate or not, is to contribute to this phone amnesty table here throughout the evening, which is just a little soupçon of an experience of being off-grid, just for a few minutes. And I think it is startling how uncomfortable that is for people nowadays, how it makes them feel, again, out of the loop and possibly part of a kind of endangered and threatened minority if they dare to resile, even for a few minutes, from this great humming, pulsing worldwide network. So if you're approached by one of these young people asking to take your phone, they're going to take a Polaroid photo of you, and then they're going to put your phone on one of the phone amnesty tables. And don't worry, because you'll have eyes on your own phone the whole time, just in case you sort of suffer a terrible access of anxiety. I was sort of talking just before the lecture began about, how did we do stuff before we had a phone? Okay, how did we even get stuff done? So a thinker I particularly like and return to again and again, Levi Strauss, the anthropologist, made the observation that when we alter scale, we sacrifice the sensible in favor of the intelligible. So the most obvious example of that is a map. When you create a paper map, obviously it's in two dimensions. It's in 2 dimensions, and it's expressing 3 and arguably even 4. You can't feel the grass that's indicated on the map. You can't climb the hills that are indicated by contour lines. But you need the map to make the territory intelligible to you. Now, I do think that the kind of sacrifice of the sensible that we make when we engage with the world through bidirectional digital media is deeply profound. I think it's a shift and an alteration in the nature of human being, okay? Rather kind of tough idea. Why do I think that? It's because I think that the way the world is intelligible to us is through the sensible. In other words, I don't think you can understand your being in the world unless you use your senses, unless you touch that world, unless you hold that world, unless you move through that world, unless you feel the interplay of your body with that world. The world is haptic. It is subject in it that way to being felt and held, okay? So this little project here, and you may have noticed the screens out in the atrium there that are also, in a sense, placing or giving tangible form, sensible form to the kind of closed loop of bidirectional digital media, are both interventions that have been devised by our new artist in residence here at Brunel, Phil Coy, who has an illustrious pedigree. I'm not going to give you his whole CV, because what I'd like to suggest is those of you who live in the local area should think of the campus over the next few months as a kind of arena of the sensible for you, okay? Phil's going to be making a number of interventions around the campus that are designed to reunite physical and human geography. What I would argue is our dependence on a data-driven technology is sundering those two. It's taking the physical reality of where we are away from where we think we are. So here physically are your phones, but when you're on your phone, you're often somewhere else. You're in some kind of media stream, you may be watching something, you may be in communication with somebody else, or you may be simply experiencing the world through your phone, okay? So what we want to do with this residency is to refocus the thinking both of students, staff, and what we like to think of as the Brunel community on the very physical reality of the campus. Okay, so on the way here this evening, I saw a middle-aged couple with some dogs walking along, and I stopped them and I said, do you work for the university? And they said no. They looked a little sheepy about this. And I said, because I have that kind of, I look like a cop. I mean, so I was kind of questioning them. And they said, well, you're not going to throw us out, are you? I said, no, I'm delighted to see you here. I'm delighted to see you here. We need local people to come onto the campus. The title of Phil's residency is You Are Here. We like to think of ourselves as an international university. We have a great number of international students and we welcome them. Many of them come to us via Heathrow. 70 million passengers arrive and leave every year. It's that way. 3 miles south of here. I always encourage my own students to orient themselves. Where are you, students? Can you point to the south? Can you point to the north? I ask them things like, what's the name of the river that runs through the campus? Where does that river, where is its source? Where does it rise? And where does it join a distributary of the Colne? Okay, I take my students to visit the Great Barn at Harmondsworth, a 14th century building that John Betjeman called the Cathedral of Middlesex. Extraordinary building, the largest wooden structure in southern England. Been there for many, many years. And I point out to them that structure, the Great Barn at Harmondsworth, due to have the third runway virtually stop at its door, the Great Barn at Harmondsworth is the kind of aircraft hangar of its era. It is a building that reflects an economic reality that existed in this region prior to the current era. I try and encourage these students to, as it were, access the intelligible, again, through the sensible. Not through data that can be digitized in any way, but to things that have a much more sticky quality to them, things that can be felt. So You Are Here is going to run for the next few months, and Phil Coy's interventions are all aimed at this knitting back together of human and physical geography. I'll be blunt. I find our campus often to be an unlovely place. I'm sorry, I just do. I don't particularly like this building. I would wager, in fact, I bet my life on it, that this building was designed on a computer. Yeah, it's a parametric design. I don't know if you know a lot about contemporary CAD/CAM systems in architecture, but they come complete with costings. So you basically put in the footprint of the building and you say what you use it for, and the program will provide you with the render, what the walls are going to look like, what the floors are going to look like, everything you can cost, you just punch a button and then it gets built. I think they look like the sort of desktop toys that executives used to play with back in the day. In other words, we've kind of everted an architecture of the internal into the external because they look like they were designed on computers, okay? I'm not committed to the built environment out of nostalgia. I'm not looking for things necessarily to be listed, but I'm disappointed to see that the John Crank building on the main quadrangle here is being demolished and is going. Part of the original so-called plate glass university to distinguish us from red brick universities. Crank building, I think, was a rather lovely piece of architecture, as are the three towers that you'll be familiar with, which date from the campus's original period, as of course is the famous lecture centre that was used in the Clockwork Orange. Many of you will be familiar with the fact that the lecture centre is built in a style known as béton brut. Called that because of its rough finish, okay? Nothing to do, the brutalism is not because the architecture looks brutal, though it's come to be understood that way. Fascinating thing about béton brut is that concrete's normally poured and set in wooden planks. So if you go up close to the lecture centre, you'll see that it's got a grain on it. You'll even see, if you look carefully, that they might have, little knots and holes. It's an organic form. It's something that you can sense, you can touch it, you can hold it, you can feel the grain of it, you can feel its heft, okay? And that's what I'd like everybody who lives in the environs of Brunel to be doing over the next few months, because these interventions are going to be both subtle and egregious, but they're going to lead us back again and again to the physical reality of this place. Since the Brown reforms in higher education, we deal, unfortunately, with a lot of stress in the university. I'm not in favor of kind of mindfulness, because, I did a mindful course a couple of years ago with a Theravada Buddhist monk, and I said to him, a man who'd been a Buddhist monk since he was 6, because he's Sinhalese, and I said, Bande, master, what do you think about this mindfulness craze in the West? And he just giggled the way that enlightened people do. Because it's a sticking plaster, really, on a lifestyle in which people are bound into a metric of time and money that the data-driven phone only reinforces. You come out of the station, you look at your phone, you see people all over this campus doing what I call the zombie walk. Like this. Okay, in what sense are they at Brunel? In what sense are they on this campus? They've come here maybe because they chose the university as a consumer might buy something on Amazon. And that's what these computerized, data-driven, large-scale surveys that are meant to, allow our student consumers to pick the best university to go to. That's how they're configured. But I see that as intermeshing with this abandonment of the sensible that we see driven really by these devices. I remember once saying to my wife, because you would see people with, in the early days of sat-nav, you'd see people with sat-nav on the thing. And I don't know about anybody else here, but actually sat-nav's quite dangerous as a driver. It just is. If you think back to before sat-nav, how much more attention you had not looking back and forth to a little screen. I don't know if we can quantify what the lives lost from sat-nav have been. But I said to my wife, what is it with sat-nav? Why can't... And she said, look, they'll introduce laws about it as soon as there's market saturation. And there's a certain human tendency in that way, I think, to not want to question these things, really because of the underlying metric of time and money that exists for everybody. But I'm saying to you, I say to you, there it is, the phone amnesty. Reinstitute the sensible. Put to one side the apparent benefits of the intelligibility of your data-driven lifestyle and start to re-engage with where you really are. Please come back onto the campus often. There's a green trail that runs through the campus. There's all sorts of other things to see and do, and they will be augmented by Phil Coy, our artist in residence, over the next few months. Thank you very much.
So our second speaker specializes in consumer and internet law and has widely published on those topics. Her monograph, Consumer Protection and Online Auction Platforms Towards a Safer Legal Framework, was published in 2015. She has acted as a consultant in a number of projects commissioned by the United Nations, Consumers International, and the European Consumer Organization. Welcome to the stage, Dr. Christine Riefa.
Good evening, thank you, Alex. My role this evening is to present to you the way the law protects, or perhaps, to be more precise, does not protect your privacy in a digital world. The purpose of my talk is, I hope, to convince you that there is a need for a seismic shift in the expectations that the law places on consumers to defend their privacy. I hope to convince you that for your data to be used legitimately, you must demand privacy and fairness by design and not as a form of redress. So how does the law protect your privacy? Well, indeed, the way the law operates at present is to grant consumers a number of rights that will give rise to legal actions, mostly in courts, in case of non-compliance. The failure of the law is not in not recognizing privacy as a major concern. Indeed, human rights laws in particular make it clear that the right to privacy is an essential human right. Besides, data protection laws, and the most famous of which I'm sure you know is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations 2018, were devised to ensure the respect of this human right, the right to privacy, and define more precisely the contours of what are acceptable use of personal data, and also making sure that operations and processing of data meets required standards. Indeed, the legislation in place recognizes 7 rights of data subjects, you and me, including transparency and fairness. Now, the legislation seeks to ensure that all data subjects are able to give consent to the collection and treatment of their data. But for a very long time, human rights and data protection concerns were mostly centered around the use of data by the state or emanations of the state. The interaction were between citizens and a state. With the digital revolution, if we want to call it this, data collection has become a commercial activity. It is no longer simply within the realm of an interaction with the state, public law, but within the private law realm that we are talking about extraction of data and processing of data. And indeed, it's no longer about citizens, it's about consumers. And this is where my field of expertise lies: consumer protection and market law. Now, consumer protection law offers some potential responses to the use of data and the protection of privacy. And a number of consumers associations in the recent past have started acting on your behalf. We have a Mr. Schrems, who is the founder of NOYB, an organization that stands for None of Your Business. It's a person from Austria, this Mr. Schrems, and he brought a test case in front of the European Court of Justice, trying to start a class action, a collective action on behalf of all consumers that were using Facebook. Unfortunately, the claim was rejected by the Court of Justice. The only thing he's been allowed to do is bring his own case against Facebook for violation of its privacy. The Data Protection Authority in France has recently fined Facebook also 50 million euros for the breaches of data protection that I'm sure you've all heard about, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and simply the use of data without data subjects being really aware of what processing and amalgamation of data might actually take place. In Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Belgium, a collective action also has been brought to the courts against Facebook again, regarding the use of the data that was made based on the fact that the data collection was misleading. Facebook did not clearly explain to people using their platform that their data not only would be collected and treated in a certain way, i.e. sold to third party for a profit, but also paired up with other platform data that Facebook has access to, WhatsApp, Instagram, and also with third-party data. What you might not be aware of is that when you are on Facebook, your data gets collected whether you like it or not. When you are using Google Chrome that you think you are browsing privately, you not at all, Google still has access to your browsing data and can actually do something with it. So the main consumer protection issue here is around the fact that social media in particular, but also all of websites that you will interact with, order from, are collecting data about yourselves and not only use the data perhaps to send you your order or to tailor the news that you want to see, but also to be able to repackage that information, group it with something else, and use it as a different tool. And indeed, from a commercial perspective, there are some rather cynical uses of data that have been done. For example, targeted advertising can be a good thing, but when it starts being targeted for a particular purpose and you start seeing the same thing to nudge you into an actual purchase, or when the price that you will pay for your flight is magically higher because you are browsing from Kensington and therefore a wealthier area, and you are browsing from a Mac because it's a more expensive piece of machinery, you start seeing how, as a consumer, this use of the data you didn't even think about is quite problematic. So it leads to price discrimination. The free websites that you're accustomed to as well are not free. The reality is you're paying. It's just that data now is the currency. And it's for all those reasons that consumer law can actually assist. It is actually misleading to proceed with selling your data, using your data in those ways, when in fact you are not fully informed of what is being done. Now, Facebook has been fined £8.9 million in Italy by the Italian authority for competition, but actually they are in charge of enforcing consumer laws there for exactly that kind of usage of consumers' data. Competition law can also offer some remedies, and there's a most recent case from the Federal Cartel Office in Germany who's found Facebook also guilty of abuse of their dominant position for repackaging the data with WhatsApp and Instagram contents that they had. Now, with the law, the main issue is really what can be done with the rights that we have. And I think the point is simple. We have a lot of rights. The problem is, how do we enforce them? And there are many, many obstacles to the effectiveness of the law that's in the books. Now, the main obstacle, perhaps from my point of view, is the fact that despite the laws in place, a large chunk of businesses still ignore the law. And they use what are known as dark patterns to force users into agreeing to data collection and treatment. So a typical example, and I'm sure you will have noticed if you're browsing the internet quite often, is that when you visit a website that you've never visited before, you will have a pop-up window asking you to review your privacy, the privacy policy, to agree to it. And obviously agreeing to it is a big green button. The disagreeing with it is a tiny little piece of, sometimes you even have to go, where is it? And not only that, when you start disagreeing or you want to tailor what data you might want to share, or what type of usage you want your data to be used towards, you will have to navigate quite a number of screens and undo buttons, okay? They're always on. Very rare are the websites that actually put them off and you have to turn them on. So you have to take them off, and then you have the essential cookies, the essential tools that a website needs actually to be able to service you. Yes, there are some advantages in technology. But then you have non-essentials, or you have cookies that enable targeted advertisements, so you have to deselect that. And then there's also partner companies that you are dealing with. And then you have a long list of all of them that actually are placing cookies on your activity on Facebook or on Amazon or on any website that you might consult. And the list is really long. And very perversely, some sites even do it that the first 10 or 12 are off, okay? So you're thinking, oh, good, I'm good. And then if you scroll down, oh, it's green, that one is on. Okay, I'll take it off. It took me last week 4 minutes to go through the entire exercise on a website I will not name. But if you ask me afterwards, I will tell you. And therefore, those practices are really trying to tap into the idea that consumers are just going to give up. We also are in a state where, I think that joins onto Will's point, we are attached to our machines to a point that actually we trust them. We surely do not think that anything bad can happen from that little phone that we carry everywhere. And yes, I do read my Twitter feed before I go to bed. So that's really where the issue lies, that the consent that we are actually giving, or officially by law we are giving, is not real. It's not consent that is truly fully informed. I'm sure most of you would be horrified if I was to do the list of all the nasty things that Facebook does to your data, including photos of your children are no longer yours. They are Facebook forever, and they can do whatever they like with them. So there was a study done by a Norwegian consumer association which actually showed how intrusive of privacy the practices of Google and Facebook were, and how, in fact, they were not simply nudging towards compliance and accepting the privacy default, but actually effectively forcing consumers to do so. And unfortunately, this state of affairs is really strangely aligned with market structures. The businesses that operate have got a perverse incentive to ensure that you will comply to the privacy settings they wish to impose on you, because they cannot remain competitive if they cannot package your data and resell it. Because to stop and respect your privacy would require you to start paying for using a tool like Facebook. And therefore, we have this very perverse effect that because we are in a model where the businesses need to maximize their profits and siphon up all of the money to their shareholders as opposed to making sure that consumers get a fair share, we end up where competition actually encourages and exacerbates those bad practices. So how do we fix the law? Well, one point I haven't touched on yet is about the fact that our data processing are really global, and that really creates a problem as well. The law is constructed around the idea of territoriality, that the law in England will apply in England and doesn't really have a reach much further out. So therefore, we have a problem because a lot of the data collection might happen in England, but it will actually be processed in another state. Now, in Europe, the GDPR actually has an interesting model because it forces a transnational reach. So every data subject who's European-based requires protection of their rights, and therefore all businesses across the world have to respect the rules in place. But that's easier said than done. It's obviously extremely difficult, even if you could say, as a data subject from England, that you have a right and that a company in India or the US has mistreated your data. How do you sue them? How do you actually get that right respected? So to really fix the law, I think the solution is in a shift of expectations. So far, it's always the aggrieved party, i.e. the consumer, that has to take matters in their own hands and has to verify that their rights are not violated, and if they are, takes action in front of the courts, mostly. And that's what those consumers associations I've discussed are doing. Effectively, they're doing it in the name of consumers, but they are leading what are known collective or class actions. So individual consumers are behind those actions. And in fact, the one in Italy, Spain, Belgium, and Portugal has now got 75,000 consumers that have joined, asking for €200 per head for the misuse of the data by Facebook. But again, the essential problem is we expect the consumer to do something, to be aware, to read the terms and conditions, to ensure that they are unticking those boxes on first visit, to take control of their privacy. And yet we have market structures that mean that we will be forever pitched against the businesses that can only survive and thrive and reward their shareholders if they continue to nudge us in the way that they want so they can continue to profit from our data. So my proposal is to really think of that complete change. 360 turn, it was the consumer that had to be careful. I want businesses to be expected to behave fairly. So most of my most recent work is about that. It's a new book that will come out in a few months, hopefully, on consumer theories of harm. And it shows, through economic analysis, how market structures are pitched and are designed to effectively violate the rights of consumers. And for business to survive, they have to continue going against the grain of the law and rely on the fact that consumers, we can be a bit lazy, but also we have no chance. Who reads terms and conditions? Who can actually spend the time to do so? Even if you wanted to be this wonderful consumer that does everything right, it's actually not rational to do so. So bizarrely, consumer law and a lot of the legislation we have in place is built on neoclassical economics, this idea that the consumer is fully rational, that equipped with the right information, we will make the right choices. And guess what? Actually doing nothing is the most rational thing. So our laws are built on the premise that we ought to be rational and defend ourselves, but actually not doing anything is in fact the rational thing to do. So we're being punished twice. So the solution, the legal solution, is about an obligation. There will be a positive obligation and a general obligation to trade fairly. And what that means is that it would be a tool that can evolve over time. So we bypass the problem of preparing for the future. We can apprehend the issues of artificial intelligence, use of our data by algorithms, use of decisions made by algorithm, by simply letting a judge decide what would be a reasonable use, what would be fair, but expect that the business would have actually have done that by default, by design, in the first place, meaning that in the current climate, the fact that Facebook is bent on trying to extract as much data out of you as is physically possible would not be a fair premise, and therefore would mean that the company falls within the realm of the obligation, meaning that sanctions could be imposed. At the moment, the way the law really works is a very intricate demonstration in court for which most privacy violations are very unlikely to work. Now, it's interesting that in Italy, there seems to be a very positive view of the practices, but I am not sure that in the rest of Europe and in England, we would see the same results without this real change in the law and is changing the focus from the user, from the consumer, to the business to trade fairly. So I hope I've convinced you that it is necessary to move away from the status quo to start looking at privacy and fairness by design. And if you want to know more, there's a number of outlets you can consult or follow me on Twitter, because I keep tweeting about this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. And our final speaker is Professor of Information Systems, Panos Louvieris. He leads the Defense and Cybersecurity Research Group in the Department of Computer Science. His research explores cybersecurity, data and information fusion, predictive analytics, decision support systems, and augmented reality. And I really want to know what this is. So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Panos Louvieris.
Yes. Well, welcome everybody, and it is indeed a pleasure for me to be presenting this evening. I'd like to actually reflect on a project that we were sponsored for by the EPSRC. I'd like to first of all start off defining what a prosumer is. A prosumer is somebody who produces and consumes a product. In this case, the product is data. We all leave a digital signature with our telephones and our clickstream online. We leave a trail everywhere, okay? But do we have the right to trade that data? It is possible to trade that data, but can we actually control that data? How does that affect our privacy? So, trading data, there is a question there, can that change our perception about privacy itself? Is there a privacy paradox? So, when it comes to personal data, we need to distinguish about ownership and data access rights. In the UK and the EU, in Europe, it's about data access rights because we don't actually own where the storage is of the data itself. So we actually have to control the rights, and we have to grant permission. There's a whole thing about subject access rights where you can actually get your data under the DPA, Data Protection Act, and then you can transmit that wherever you like. So the important question is, what control and monetization rights do consumers currently have over their data? Can they actually take the data? Can they take control? Can they trade it and monetize it? In other words, reverse the cash flows. Instead of using Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, etc., can you actually trade that data and get a return? So in the main, are you trading, what value are you trading? So can we control the big techs? The big techs are larger than governments, they're larger than countries in many ways, and they control a lot of data about you, and as we heard earlier, they can also nudge you. So in terms of protecting your rights, it's not about preventing people observing what you do, but it's also preventing them nudging you and controlling you. So in this project we were funded by the EPSRC, Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council. The the research question there was to explore whether people could control their data and actually trade it, and we built a trading platform to do that. But moreover, does it change the perception of that data? They may value that data, but actually when it comes to somebody giving them money, they might say, oh yeah, I might, and if it's the right price, I might actually sell it. So that's what we were exploring. So this slide here really illustrates we as prosumers who create and consume data, at the moment, we give it away to Google, we give it away to social media platforms like Facebook, but we get a service in return. That's fine, so you can use the search engines, etc. You can engage with various communities, you get various services. That's fine, but how much value are you giving away? Why can't you control that data? Why can't you take that new oil, if you like, the World Economic Forum, that's the way it describes it, and actually trade that data yourself directly, cut out the middleman, essentially. So if you were to get the same service, a search engine and maybe some social media services, but at the same time could monetize your own data, what would you prefer to do? Go with Google, Facebook, etc., or would you go with a digital prosumer platform? So, interesting question. So, the digital self. At the center of this slide here, this blue hub here, you see digital personhood. That's how you're defined in legal terms as a person. But we have different facets about our digital personhood, our different personas. So we might have a energy persona. So how much energy we consume, when do we consume it? We have a shopping persona. What type of things do we buy? When do we consume these products? We have a travel persona, etc. So what happens here? All this data can be collected and it can say so much about you, and it can identify your interests, activities, opinions, your behavior, and it enables you to be targeted. So here we have the example. You may have an Oyster card. Yeah? You may have a device that monitors your TV usage, right? So this might leave you exposed to nudging to become maybe an online gambler, right? So you can be manipulated. But you have the right to control your data if you could trade it. So there's some interesting questions in terms of privacy, and at what point should you maintain privacy? What are you giving away? Are you really aware of what you're giving away? That's where the paradoxes come in. So we created this platform, the Digital Prosumer platform, and there's a website there, which is www.digitalprosumer.co.uk, and you can see the website and actually see all the terms and conditions that align with the GDPR and many of the points the last speaker made. It's there to actually help us conduct our research, but also allow us to trade, to experiment and trade data. And this is what we did. Let me explain the platform very simply. So what happens, you as a prosumer, on the left-hand side there, collect and consent to the sharing of your personal data. The digital prosumer trading platform then aggregates the data, so as a collection of people aggregated together, you create this tradable asset. So, and that can be auctioned. Bids from the buyers are matched to the offers from the prosumer, and then contracts are signed, and the buyer gets the data, and you get paid. But we can create data futures whereby we can collect data over a period of, say, 3 months and deliver it at 3 months in the future. That creates all kinds of possibilities with the Internet of Things, like smart devices in the home. And you could be passively generating an income, by actually just being you and behaving the way that you do. Now, that's all very well and good. We also conducted a survey, really to assess whether people, what data would they like to trade, or what data would they like to keep private. And what we found was the following, that they're happy to trade their shopping data, their energy data, etc. They're not quite sure about health, because if they share their health data, it might help the society at large. But they were very unhappy to trade their email and financial data. So you think, okay, so if we put these people in a situation where they have to trade data, what would they do? So we had this trading game, and what you see is the vertical axis is the price, and the horizontal axis is the rounds. We did this game in rounds, so it's bidding and selling. So and then the price converges. So the black is the bidder, and the other colours are the actual prosumers. But what you see in this trading game is that when it comes to selling their data, in particular this group of people, they were quite willing to sell their bank account and email data. Because if they didn't sell it at this time, they would lose the opportunity. So they actually monetize their data. So there's a paradox there. When people say one thing, actually do another. So I better crack on. The law, in terms of law and legal precedents, so the GDPR and Data Protection Act have already been covered. But let me just focus on the Investigatory Powers Act. Essentially, you may be protected by the Data Protection Act, but government departments, maybe the police, courts, do have rights as well in terms of protecting the society, to have access to that data as well. So that's legitimate snooping under warrant. So you have to get a warrant, so a judge has to sign it, and then your data can actually be accessed without your permission. So differential privacy is also important. Organisations like the Office for National Statistics, they actually use differential privacy to add noise to your data so you cannot be identified. So you can become anonymous. But does that actually really work? We see in some cases, Google takes cow privacy very seriously. So they have this algorithm, okay, and then you can see that poor old Daisy up there, her face is fuzzy, so you can't actually recognize it is Daisy. So sometimes AI doesn't quite work the way we want it to work, but nevertheless, it's important to demonstrate that differential privacy kind of doesn't always work, but it makes the point though. So what's happening now, we also have what we call the surveillance society. So in China, they have this, what they call the sharp eyes a policy now, where they collect lots of data about you and they make assessments, okay? They can fine you, they can reward you, they can stop you from purchasing airline tickets unless you go and make a donation. But they're not, of course, they're not the only people who do that. And of course, in this case, they use facial recognition as well, so they can recognize you in the crowd. So how private are you? This is where the state actually takes control of your personal data, etc. But they think they're doing it for the good. But there's a trade-off here. So what's in the public interest and what's for the social, for the social good versus privacy. So, of course, in London as well, we have all these cameras and we have this secure watchful eyes from the London Underground and London Transport. Okay, so it's all over the world. It's not just in China or in London or in New York or Russia. It's the same thing. So we have the Surveillance Society, and there's a book out by Susanna Zuboff that addresses and discusses this issue. So what are we going to do in the future? We have to consider whether we want to remain private, and at what price privacy. It's all a moot point. And do we go off-grid in the sense that, is this what we have to do? So, of course, we can't escape the digital technologies, but it's about how we organize ourselves from a legal perspective, right? It's how we organize ourselves from an ethical perspective as well. These are real issues. It's not just about the technology. Well, anyway, thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much. And can I now invite our three speakers who have made a fantastic contribution in me understanding this, not as my best friend anymore, my little pet, the one I dress in my favorite color, but as an enemy. So can we take questions? Please.
Would you buy a Chinese computer, like PC or laptop, on the grounds that, well, you know, if the Chinese are...
Shall we just wait? Sorry, I don't want to, just to wait for the microphone so that everybody can hear you.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
I repeat, would you buy a Chinese computer, so a desktop or a laptop, on the grounds that, not buy it, on the grounds that there's probably something in there that's being used to spy on you, you know, based on, you know, what's going on the radio now about the, you know, Chinese electricity company, etc.
Thank you. Shall we take a couple more questions and maybe we can address, our speakers can address all of them, please.
Yeah, I think everybody appreciates that the government and regulatory authorities have actually acted exceedingly slowly on protecting people. Now, am I being cynical in thinking that it's because they and the secret services require that access that people like Google, Facebook also make use of? Do you think that that is actually related to it?
Thank you. And maybe a third question, the gentleman at the back.
Hello, I would like to ask you, have you researched the incognito browser? Because you are able to choose if you want to browse through the incognito browser. Yes, so have you researched if they collect data in the same way as the simple browser?
Thank you. And finally, the gentleman at the back.
Remember this?
And then we'll, you know, if our speakers can answer to your questions, then we'll have a second round.
When we talk about personal privacy rights, try and remember, we're also living in an age of biotechnology and genetics and chromosomes and stuff, where if you give away that data or link to that data, it's not just your decision, it's your family or tribe or racial group as well. Is that being addressed or really thought about properly?
Thank you. So shall we start from Will?
There's a very good, yes, a very good book by Gordon Carrera on the role of the state and engagement with, I don't know if I can pronounce it right, Huawei. And, you know, the current situation at the moment is that the engineers, the Chinese engineers that are working on the new 5G system have to be kind of cleaned down and searched before they go into a special sort of security locked room in order to work on the coding and on the hardware that's going into the new 5G network, okay? So the government, as far as I'm aware, have acknowledged the security risk represented by having a foreign state working on the 5G network, and what they do to ameliorate it is to screen the engineers who are working on it. It's crazy. And for once, that even crazier person, Donald Trump, is probably right about this. You know, a stopped clock is right at least twice a day. And I think that the involvement of the Huawei, which is no more independent than any large Chinese business is from the Chinese government, is frankly ridiculous in our telecommunications system. It makes an absolute mockery, for example, of Brexit and taking back control to open this back door into our
Absolutely. What I'd like to add to Will's point, question from over here, is that the chips that we use, the ARM chips that we have in the phones, right, they're actually not very well protected. All your personal data goes through that chip. And it's basically, you can actually hack those phones quite easily and pick up that data. The National Cybersecurity Centre is very much aware of this. So all the focus has been very much at at the application layer of the security stack. But when you start going down to more physical layers, that's not really been attended to. And in terms of the other question over here, it really depends on what you want to protect. And it's about, it's about the risk. What risk, you need to ask yourself, what do I want to lose? So it's a risk judgment that you have to make first. So, and can I just answer the last question over here? Regarding the bioinformatics question, that's a very interesting question because, you go to the States and they take your retina scan, they take your fingerprints and other information. They probably know more about us than our own government does, by the way. So one trip to America, you give away a lot. But moreover, work done at MIT in particular, they're actually linking your voice signature. So looking at understanding the anatomy and physiology of your voice and your larynx, actually gives away personality traits. And the other point that you can add as well to that, which is a bit more scary, because of your accent, etc., you can determine your postcode. So when you ring up the university and they say, oh, by the way, you get that voice in the background that says, we're recording your voice for training purposes, are they actually breaking the Data Protection Act and the GDPR? I bet you didn't think about that, huh? So, anyway, next questions, I guess.
I think perhaps I'll try and give my thoughts. I think the 4 questions are raising different dimensions of essentially the same problem, which is we seem to be in a perverse situation now where we are trusting big businesses more than we trust our states. Now, very interestingly, there might be a good reason for that. And in America, I know that there's such a thing as third-party doctrine, which is effectively the rules under which surveillance authorities need a warrant to obtain data on individuals, but if information about the individuals was given freely to a company, they can actually request that data directly from the company without the individual even having to know that the data request is being made. So to a lot of extent, surveillance authorities in the US were very happy with Facebook because there we were, just giving them everything they needed to know about us, quite happily. And Facebook, I think, played a part in that surveillance aspects where they changed their privacy setting because originally Facebook was very much, you could choose the audience and it would be private. But I can't remember the exact date, but there was a point where they changed their privacy settings to everything became public and you had to go back into Facebook to put everything to private. So there is a bit of a perverse effect there where we have this tension between giving the data and protecting ourselves from the state, but don't seem to be too worried yet about giving the same data to businesses that can use it to make profits, but also will still give it to the state when they are required to do so. So I think that's an interesting tension. So to link with the point about whether I would buy a Chinese computer, probably yes. Because I think the main issue we have is we have no choice at the moment. There is no alternative, really. And I also want to perhaps dispel the Chinese example, because we always point at them. But the reality is the social credit scoring system that China is using or piloting at the moment, we do exactly the same. We just don't call it that. So if you're not a good citizen in China, you can be prevented from staying at the best hotel or booking the best hotel or booking a flight and traveling. Well, price discrimination algorithm do exactly that. They actually change the price depending on a formula, and we have no control over that formula either.
That happens when you go buy insurance anyway.
Yeah, and we are also profiled on our health habits, and so all of that actually exists in our societies as well. So on that basis, I probably wouldn't really mind where the computer is coming from. That would be a different question. On the browser, I don't know very much because I'm not an IT person. You will all have noticed that. But I do know that the incognito setting is simply incognito, that your family member picking up the computer will not know what you've looked for. But Google knows. And Google retains that data, and there is also such a thing as data retention of encrypted data, in the hope that in 5-10 years' time you would have algorithms that could crack the data. So a lot of those companies are actually retaining data that they can't even read at the moment either. So the incognito is if your boyfriend is finally looking for the ring, you will not know, but the reality is Google knows. The same way that Asda knows, and you know, your supermarket knows that you are pregnant before you know your other half does, because you bought the test from them. So I won't be able to answer your question though, because I have absolutely no knowledge or thoughts on that. So sorry.
Thank you. Next question, maybe the gentleman at the back.
First of all, thank you very much. I think very enlightening. My question, as well as a comment, I love the bucket right there. Is it really time to redefine privacy? Or the other thing that I would say is, how would you define privacy? If I were to say as, okay, leave me alone. Is that how, you know, legally you would say the definition of privacy is?
Yeah,
All
okay.
technology firms would say, okay, we have left you alone, you're coming to us. The freemium model got mentioned. The Uber balance got mentioned. If I look at my phone, which I'm having in my pocket, over the last 10 years, I have been using the geospatial data, the digital DNAs, these chronicles, these digital traces we leave behind. So we are being watched through advanced analytics. These digital DNAs are analyzed. Our past, our present, our future can be predicted by the use of data. This neophilia, I believe, is because technological advancement, whether we accept it or not, is so well advanced, so ahead of us, that we can't really do away without it. Why I say this? Because I think privacy paradox got mentioned. I strongly agree with that. In my own research, which is around privacy and security and also big data, I have come to this sort of conclusion I say is probably law is far behind as to what these technological firms are really capable to sort of capture, or they already have done, which we can't imagine they're capable of. So is it time that privacy is redefined, is my question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Shall we take the mayor's question before we move on?
Thank you.
Sorry, do you want to wait for the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Don't you think it's already too late? We're trying to close the stable door, but the horses are already bolted. I mean, so with our mobile phones, you can be tracked. The only way you can't be tracked is by switching that mobile phone off. If it's on, you can be found. When we had the Malaysian airplane that disappeared, they were tracking that plane at the time. They knew roughly where it was, because some people actually had their phones on. And now we're looking at microchips being implanted into humans. They had a demonstration of that this morning on Breakfast TV, where literally between the thumb and forefinger, a small microchip was implanted. And that microchip could access bank accounts, get them through doors and all sorts of things. So surely, we're too late. It's already happened.
Thank you. Can I use my position as the chair to ask a question as well? What is so wrong with why do we have to protect our privacy to such a degree? What is wrong with people knowing that at the moment at 7:45 I am at Brunel University? What is even wrong if some people, not companies, some people have access to my children's kind of faces. Are we doing maybe something similar to what Will is trying to prevent us from doing? Are we removing ourselves, by this obsession on privacy, are we maybe removing ourselves from the world and from interaction and from sharing parts of our lives, which is essentially parts of ourselves? So, all three questions.
I mean, there's three very big questions, all great questions.
Right, so we have three questions, and, please, Panos, would you like to start first?
Yeah,
and then?
okay. I think we're at the early stages of all this, I would call this problem space, because it is a problem. Technology is changing so fast, and we had the case of Uber, it was doing things legally, then when they realised, they're doing it illegally now, they're not being fair to their employees, etc. So it does take time, from a social and legal perspective for things to catch up. But then the technology advances again, and it advances even faster. So now we have the advent of the, people talking about the quantum computer. So if I've got a quantum computer and I can kind of brute force all your accounts in a few milliseconds, then how are you going to stop me? Right? So the technology can actually supersede these arguments and create a new set of problems. So then are we talking about kind of quantum privacy? It's another thought, you see. And it's the pace of technology versus the pace of the, if you like, the legal frameworks that come into being as well. But I think the bigger question really is what kind of society do you want? I think you articulated it really well. Because at the end of the day, we all pay taxes, right, for the common good. So is it that privacy is something that we are kind of being too protective about? We know that people were willing, from our results, were willing to trade data about their health because it might help, research into, for example, curing cancer and things like this. So it's kind of privacy for what, really? And it's about, is it for the public good versus, your individual privacy? It's what is privacy for is the question. What are the risks to the individual? What are the risks of privacy of the individual in terms of the public good and things like this? So I don't think we've really discussed what privacy is and what its impacts really are, because the associations have not been made yet. So I don't think that's real, because the genie's out of the bottle basically. But I think the idea that making people feel uncomfortable about leaving their phones there actually makes a really good point. But it's how do we reconcile these different perspectives? Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Christine?
I think I'll just jump on the comment about we all paying our taxes. Well, the big companies don't really, do they? And that's where I think I've got a problem with the idea that we are giving our data without knowing what we're giving.
Yeah, true.
And that's, I think, part of the fundamental problem is the fact that the businesses we give our data to are operating on a model where I'm not really sure what I'm giving up. No one here let's do show of hand. Who's read the terms and conditions of Facebook, Twitter, or any social media that you're using? Be brave, put your hands up. Of course, Howard, you're a law professor. Anyone? We've got a few. Sorry, you're a bit isolated here. But most people don't. And even if you do, can I then ask you, did you really understand what you were giving up? Do you feel that you were completely agreeing to something that you understood?
Sorry, I asked.
Yes,
you, impressively mustachioed gentleman.
My question was very simple. Is there anyone left in the world who we can trust?
All right. Perhaps that's not my department to answer that. But I think the issue is that. I think the issue is even if we were to even remotely understand the terms and conditions, I'm a consumer lawyer. I do understand them. we have no alternative either. There is not another platform where I really can go. So I think the problem with privacy and being too late, I think it's a good point. We might be slightly too late, but it's never too late to change course. Otherwise, history would be on one track and we would never stop the train. So I think it will take quite a seismic change. From a legal perspective, it's really important that we shift this emphasis, and I think that's really where all my work is focused on the moment, is fairness by design, because fairness is a really good concept that can evolve over time and be defined by reference to local preference and enable people to still regain some control over their privacy that has been given up. It doesn't need to anticipate also, because the problem we have is we have laws that say one thing, and the big business will pay good lawyers, actually, to actually circumvent what the law says. Whereas if you have an open, principled concept, you are enabling a judge on the ground to react to a particular set of circumstances. And I think we have to perhaps try and move forward. As to the definition of privacy, I think it will remain a huge problem. I think there are social circumstances, there are territory circumstances, cultural circumstances that mean we all will think of something quite different. But I agree with you that technology is not bad per se, and I don't want to be seen as this woman that says technology is awful. I think it's great, and I love it that I can be in touch with my friends and I can do all of those things on Facebook. I just wish they told me exactly what they had in mind so that I could actually make a decision at the time I made it.
Will?
Yes, thank you. I think there were three things we have to address, actually, that this problem with data is heavily implicated in, and we can't really step away from. We've got to meet them head on. One is the transnational aspect of the large FANG businesses. That's really important. It's undermining the capacity of nation-state governments to do their thing. And it's not unrelated to this interpenetration of the virtual and the actual that the technologies themselves represent. And it's not unrelated to the way that they deterritorialize us. They make us not feel as if we are where we really are, okay, in that sense. And that's what they want us to feel in a way, because if we're imprecise about where we are, their exact knowledge of where they are is of more value to them. So I think we can't dodge that question. It's a really, really important issue, and our government should be really trying to get to grips with that. On the issue, the more kind of existential issue of what is privacy, I think that's right. You know, try telling somebody from a different kind of culture and a different background, you know, that we have this great premium on privacy and we want to be like this. For most of human history, the idea of the kind of privacy we think we enjoy has been absolutely meaningless. And actually, did we ever really enjoy it? You know, all sorts of people, you know, if you're a parent, you know that you have no privacy a lot of the time, or no real privacy in the ways that matter, you know. So, or if you're a member of a close-knit community, or you look back in the past, the way working environments didn't allow you any privacy at all. You had to live a think about Wakes weeks, when everybody from the Lancashire Mills went on holiday together. They worked together all year. So in a sense, I think we've created a temple to an idea of privacy that we neither necessarily exercised ourselves, it was a latent capacity, nor did we really live in that way. However, let's just consider the hypothetical idea of privacy in as much as it supports the idea of autonomy. In as much as, you know, people say, well, what do I have to fear from these surveillance technologies? What do I have to fear from this data mining? I'm not doing anything wrong, okay? But it's not really about whether you're doing anything wrong. It's about whether you have the latent and perhaps only latent capability to do something right. You know, what I think we've seen, and I think the new technologies are responsible for this, is the weaponization of ignorance and stupidity. Yeah? It's being used by these technologies to create more extremism in our society, a greater polarization of views, to essentially make it possible through manipulation of data to move people. And essentially it started to collapse the distinction between representative and direct democracy as well. And it's why we're seeing, I would argue, a rise in populist ideologies at the moment on both the right and the left. So I think big data is implicated in that. I think we cannot resile from dealing with it. It's not something, it's too dangerous for us to sit still. I think everybody in this lecture theatre knows fine well what I'm talking about.
Thank you. And final round, please.
Yeah, I have two set of questions. One is associated with the right to be forgotten, or the principle that if I want to be a distinct personality, I have one job during the day and I have a hobby at night, and both of them are incompatible. I don't want my colleagues to know what I'm doing in my hobby at night, because it's an artist stuff and my colleagues are very serious and formal, but my joy is doing my hobby at night, singing or whatever I like. To keep these two sides separated is important to me, but I am at risk to be linked by a third or by a surveyor or somebody that can expose these two things together. So I want to be forgotten at work and I want to be forgotten at my hobby. I don't want to be linked, that they can trace me up and down wherever I go. So, and somebody could just say, I moved country, I don't want to be remembered. Whatever I left behind is behind, and I want to start again from fresh. So all that data has to be evaporated, and I want to be forgotten back there, for a reason, any reason. The second issue I want to explore is what just said right now, is one thing I know is we are creating new constituencies that are not territorial. We are creating layers upon layers of group of people that think in a way we are linked, we are together by age, by different tastes of life, and we are together and we have a voting power in a certain direction. So my question is, big data and this technology is discovering, and it's a golden age for technology mining companies, that we are understanding the herd behavior, not individual behavior, how we do together things.
That's great. I think this was the second round. The third round. Two questions.
Yeah,
Shall we?
So just the question is this: democracy is changing, and how we exercise the power to participate in democracy is dramatically changing. So I don't know if we have to rewrite the access to political spheres, given the state of constituencies.
Thank you. So if you can take a minute to respond, but also kind of your closing, if you want to, your final comments before we move to wine.
Do you want to take it first?
Letting me go first.
And maybe Christine should start first.
Okay, on the right to be forgotten, I think the right is actually probably a misnomer. The way the data protection laws are actually organized is you're not really forgotten. It's just that the information that is in the public domain can actually be removed. And there's also a number of checks and balances as to what information can be removed in order to be removed and hidden. So there's a public interest element. I'm not so sure about the right to be forgotten per se, because I'm a consumer lawyer. But I think this idea of dissociating effectively personas, it probably is not within the realm of what the right to be forgotten, as it is worded, is actually able to achieve. But I would have to double check that. On democracy, I'll completely remove my academic hat here, just to give my personal view. I think it's very worrying that we live in societies where we see a complete change in the end goal and in the way that we can be manipulated into doing things that perhaps we didn't want to do or were not sure about doing. And I'll just make a comment about Brexit here, I'm afraid. You know, the Leave campaign has been found to be overspending and committed offences. They're not being investigated by the police. That has been put off. So, yeah, I sense that I kind of agree with you. Democracy is changing. We don't really have almost the control that we ought to have as citizens, and yet, you know, things seems to happen without our say. So, privacy is almost on the same train. There's an element of lack of control that's very worrying, but I think it's not too late to regain that control, and I hope we can.
Thank you. Panos?
Yes, I would say that I'd like to come back to the right to be forgotten. When you come to the Data Protection Act, it's really about the process of what you do with the data. It's not so much about the data. It's about, you know, what's the duty of care? You know, somebody gets a benefit for something. You know, taking a Hoffeldian type perspective on this. So what's your duty of care? And what happens is when data gets passed on, you don't know where it's going to, because you know, somebody, you might sell your data, or somebody accesses your data, but it goes to a third party. But can you actually track that? And where is it going to? So is the, you know, in terms of the right to deletion, you know, because you're linking with other people, you might not be able to delete that signature because it's gone to other agents. So there are other technologies that we need to consider that, you know, which is like the blockchain. So the idea of having smart legal contracts. So how can we use, the question would be then, how can we apply smart legal contracts to help us track where your data goes and what processes have been applied to your data? So then in terms of the responsibility, the onus, then it is placed on the controller, right, and the processor of the data. So it's not the data subject. And therefore, if it's down in a smart legal contract, then the person who is passing it on is also subject to, if you like, these chained contracts, so you can actually track what's going on. Only in that way can you perhaps afford some kind of protection through these smart legal contracts. And that's what we call, you know, distributed ledgers or blockchain technologies. But, you know, and the other thing was, what was the other? Democracy. Okay, democracy. Wow, that's a
Well, we only have 2 minutes to solve the democracy issue.
Democracy is a big question. I mean, democracy, generally, you know, people vote. We've got this Brexit thing again, but, you know, whether people are making the right decisions. But actually, democracy from you know, its Greek origins is actually people vote based on knowledge, right? So how much knowledge do we really have about everything that's been going on recently? So I would say that, you know, if you can get a bit more knowledge, if, you know, maybe people contribute their data in some way, and we can actually leverage individuals' knowledge, we can perhaps have a better democracy. But maybe democracy needs to be redesigned as well.
Ba-bum.
Ba-boom.
Thank you. And Will?
Yeah, well, just the point about your multiple selves. You know, Andy Warhol said in the 1960s, in the future, everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. And one thing I can tell you is, you know, I've been quite well known since my 30s. And so when all of this stuff came along, I already knew what was going to happen, which was it was going to be that everybody, you guys, were going to be like me. And you know what it's like to be famous. You're on the train going back from West Drayton to London, and a drunk guy goes, "You're that bloke off the telly, aren't you? You're that bloke off the telly." That's what it's like for you lot now. You've basically got the equivalent electronically of a drunk man going, "You're that bloke or blokeess off the telly," right? Which makes you feel that you cannot get away from a certain representation of yourself. So, you know, hats off to you, Andy Warhol. You got it exactly right. Now, do we want to live that way or not, is the question that you have to ask yourself. Do you want to be able to enjoy the free range of autonomy that comes with having... And actually, you know, we are all multiple personae. You are not the little squidgy bear you are with your lover to your colleagues, yeah? And nor am I, for that matter. Indeed, I ever am a little squidgy bear.
That's the personhood.
Yeah. On the point about democracy, my wife once made a brilliant point about the effect of social media because, like, again, a lot of people in the public eye, I get trolled heavily on social media the whole time, and it is vicious and savage. And if you look at it at all, it would... But luckily, I was being trolled in the main media before that even happened. But my wife made the point, she said, people have always hated people who are in the public eye. It's just now you know it. Okay? And by the same token, I have to say, somewhat going back on what I said before, people have always known that democracy is a bit of a sham. The sad fact of the matter is, because the mayor has way, way more power than you do. Theresa May has way, way more power than the mayor. And Mark Zuckerberg has way more power than Theresa May. It's just that it's now made visible.
Yeah, exactly. It's big tech's regulation of the big techs. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Shall we show our appreciation for really...